The Indonesian island of Bangka was the scene of one of the most atrocious crimes of the Japanese Empire during World War II. There, a group of Australian nurses were raped and brutally massacred by Axis soldiers. A savage event, as complex as it was cruel. The only survivor was severely censored and could not speak of what had happened for many decades. This meant that those responsible never paid for their violent acts, a debt that still weighs on the families of the victims. In this new video, we will go through everything that lies behind one of the most terrible massacres that occurred during the war, which left a bloody mark on history. Get ready to discover the truth that was hidden for so long. Let's get started.
During the Second World War, a large number of atrocities and war crimes were committed by the various armies of the conflict. Some of the most brutal and savage were punished after the war had come to an end in trials, but a large number went unpunished.
This story takes us back to 1942, the moment when one of the largest massacres began, which they managed to keep hidden under dubious interests. Although to reconstruct it, we must travel a little further back in time, particularly to May 1940. Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, managed to occupy the Netherlands, which caused martial law to be declared in one of its colonies in Southeast Asia. This was the Dutch East Indies, an archipelago that after World War II gained its independence and became Indonesia. However, still under the influence of Holland and in the midst of the conflict, the territory marked its position against the Axis and declared war on the Empire of Japan after the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. In this way, tensions between both parties increased until the Japanese decided to advance with an invasion. Initially, most Indonesians welcomed the Japanese as liberators from their colonial masters. However, sentiment changed rapidly and abruptly when between 4 and 10 million people were recruited for forced labor. In January 1942, the Allied forces formed the Abdicom Command, made up of American, British, Dutch, and Australian troops. Its objective was to coordinate efforts under the command of General Archibald Wavell to defend the Malay Barrier, a line that ran from the Malay Peninsula through Singapore and the southernmost islands of the Dutch East Indies. However, despite the efforts of the soldiers seeking to assist the colony of the Netherlands, the Imperial Japanese Army almost immediately gained control of different islands in the archipelago, helped by Indonesian rebel groups that were encouraged to kill Europeans in order to fight for their independence. This is how they took advantage of the internal conflict to gain profit, dominate the territory, and begin to demonstrate the brutality that characterized them. Faced with this ferocious advance of the Asians, the entire region was thrown into panic, and different groups began to abandon cities and countries around the Dutch East Indies. One example of this was Singapore, from where ships departed with wounded soldiers and nurses who had traveled to assist them from Australia, the closest ally. Some of the ships managed to return successfully to their homes.
Home, after months which provided more experience and excitement than the average woman gets in a lifetime. And it's good to be home. The nightmare of war dissipates in the warmth of loved ones' embraces. They're with their ain folk again. Their escape with 2,500 people on a ship normally equipped to take 16 passengers and under a hail of Japanese bombs is an epic story.
A significant number of people were able to face the hostilities of the Imperial forces and still managed to reach their destination. However, there was a group that was less fortunate. They were on the ship Viner Brook, which did not manage to cross the area mined by the Japanese army and ended up succumbing to their brutal power. We are referring to the episode that took place on February 12, 1942, when everything seemed to indicate that Singapore was about to fall into the hands of the Japanese soldiers. A new ship was ready to set sail with the intention of returning home before the Axis force brought chaos and destruction to its encounter, but it was too late.
As Singapore was about to fall, 65 Australian Army nurses were evacuated on a small coastal steamer ship named the Viner Brook. Also on board the ship were over 200 civilians fleeing for their safety, and a number of English military personnel and members of staff. On board were also a number of injured members of the armed forces, but as the ship was on its way to its destination, it was attacked. Japanese aircraft were flying overhead, and they strafed and bombed the ship, which was greatly overloaded. The bombs hit the ship and it sank very quickly.
Panic reigned on board as many people clambered through the wreckage of their transport. They fought for their lives and tried to make their way to the lifeboats. What they did not know was that those who managed to reach them would be attacked by Japanese aircraft again. Several of the passengers died, either on the ship or by drowning at sea as they passed between Borneo and Sumatra. In total, 12 Australian nurses died in the attack, but there were still 53 who were willing to fight to survive alongside a group who were able to climb into the lifeboats and sail with the tide. The waves helped them reach Bangka Island, the 9th largest island in Indonesia, which today has a population of almost 1 million people. However, at that time it was a territory that had already been easily captured and occupied by the Empire of Japan. When they reached the shores, the nurses believed that their luck was about to change. They all wore their Red Cross armbands, and these were supposed to give them some kind of protection in times of war. Now, while this was true and was supposed to be the key to them being considered with a protected status as non-combatants, on the other side was one of the most savage and bloodthirsty armies in the entire conflict. The treatment would be far from respectful, and nothing that would happen next would be done in a civilized manner.
Around 100 survivors reunited together from the ship, and they met up on Radji Beach, but it was quickly realised that those who occupied the land were the Japanese. Talks were held upon landing on the beach, and an officer from the ship tried to find the Japanese to surrender the group of survivors of the ship to them and to turn over as prisoners of war.
While this officer was away, the highest-ranking surviving military nurse, Irene Melville Drummond, said that the civilian women and children should leave for the town of Muntok to protect themselves from any inconvenience that might occur. They knew that, at best, they would all end up in a prison, and the conditions in which detainees lived during World War II were truly brutal. On the other hand, even with the belief that they would achieve special and more cordial treatment for their profession, it was also decided that about 20 nurses should stay on the beach and care for any wounded survivors who were in the group. They began to set up a shelter to classify the patients, and they worked with a tag so that they could be easily identified. They carried a large red sign with a cross in the middle, indicating that they were not a military threat, but were simply administering medical care. A certain calm seemed to emerge after the adrenaline of the fierce attack on the high seas. Fires were lit on the sand, and all those who had managed to survive huddled closely together to keep warm as night fell. In this way, they could rest without knowing the fatal fate that was approaching. The next day, the ship's officer arrived on the beach with about 20 Japanese soldiers. The troops acted calmly, knowing that they were in control of the situation. Beyond their numbers, the 100 survivors who greatly outnumbered the armed men were not a threat. Soon they ordered all the wounded to gather together, and they were divided into 2 different groups. Later, members of the Imperial Army told half of the castaways to follow them, and they moved away along the coast. Uncertainty about what would happen again gave way to fear among the representatives of the Allies. It was not long before the Japanese soldiers returned. Some seemed to be cleaning their bayonets, which increased the terror. The fighters demanded that the second half of the men come with them, and they agreed without hesitation. They had no other choice. They began to walk behind the Japanese, and, as they moved away from the rest of the people on the shipwreck, they saw the bodies of the first group floating in the water. Their fate was sealed.
The nurses heard a quick volley of shots, and what the Japanese had done was just massacre around 60 British and Australian soldiers and crew members who should have been considered prisoners of war.
The victims who had not been killed initially by gunfire were later killed with bayonets or knives, that the attackers plunged into their bodies. Mercy was not a characteristic of the Imperial Army. Their enemies simply represented a piece of meat that they had to defeat, no matter how cruel or brutal they had to be along the way. When the Japanese returned to the beach where the Australian nurses were, they sat down next to them and cleaned their weapons again. Could it be possible that the medical personnel were treated differently because they did not represent a threat? We are sure you know the answer. Shortly after that encounter, and with the rest of the group massacred, the soldiers began ordering the women to stand up and form a line. Then they were simply asked to walk towards the waves of the sea. The nurses did not know it, but they had placed a machine gun on the beach. The announced end was approaching. That idea of looking for the troops occupying the territory to surrender was the worst possible decision. They had dug their own graves, and their suffering would write another of the most atrocious pages of this enormous and merciless war. While they looked towards the horizon, the nurses and a civilian woman who had remained with the group were pushed towards the water. As soon as their legs began to submerge, the roar of the projectiles annihilated the sound of the waves. The machine gun opened fire, and all its power reached the women, who began to fall one by one. The massacre on that beach was complete. A new and bloody execution was added to the list of Japanese soldiers. However, the barbarity had failed in one small aspect. Not all the nurses were dead, and the story that was thought would never come to light could be told by one of the protagonists, who now had to fight to escape from among the pile of corpses.
Vivian Bullwinkle was the only woman to have survived the attack, as a bullet passed through her body and missed her vital organs. She lay in the shallow water stunned and feigned her death, with the waves washing over her, and she only just recovered as the Japanese soldiers left.
The Australian nurse looked around and saw all of her friends and colleagues dead. Their bodies were floating in the sea, while she felt the pain of her wound that did not allow her to think clearly. Vivian Bullwinkle was worried that the soldiers would return, so her best option was to find a place to hide and hope for a miracle. Desperate, she slowly moved to the jungle surrounding the massacre beach, where she remained unconscious for several days. When she woke up, she was surprised by the presence of another person in the bushes. It was a British soldier named Patrick Kingsley, who had also survived during the attack on the ship, but was wounded in the abdomen and shoulder. Beyond having to deal with her own injuries, Vivian cared for the man for 12 days, during which they depended on the food that the locals could provide. However, both knew that they would not endure these conditions for much longer. It could be years before the Japanese surrendered, so they decided to walk to the town of Muntok to turn themselves in. Once they reached their destination, the couple was imprisoned with groups of civilians who had also been shipwrecked. However, despite avoiding being killed, death was waiting around the corner, as the prison was a cruel setting where mistreatment and beatings were as common as starvation. Now the two survivors struggled to maintain that status, but only one of them would succeed.
Kingsley passed away as he was not given any medical care, and also the Japanese gave him hardly any food. Eventually the civilians and survivors were then taken to a prisoner of war camp, and Bullwinkle spent 3 years inside of one. She had told her fellow nurses what happened at the beach, and they all swore to protect her life, to make sure that the story of the massacred men and women would be told to the world.
During all those years of imprisonment, the woman expected to be killed at any moment. Having witnessed a ferocious massacre, the Japanese might consider finishing what they had started, so that she would not tell of what happened in those brutal executions. Nevertheless, her life continued. The Australian public did not learn of the massacre until after the Second World War, when the media took notice of the event and began to talk about the day when soldiers of the Imperial Japanese Army mercilessly shot nurses, civilians, and sailors who posed no threat in the conflict. Although it was another reprehensible case of the conflict, it was probably no different from so many other acts perpetrated by the Nazis or the Japanese forces themselves. This global battle had been the scene of a great number of atrocities and crimes, which had to be punished. This is how the trials came about, such as that of Nuremberg, before which the representatives of the Third Reich had to answer for their actions. Or the International Military Criminal Tribunal for the Far East, which is charged with doing the same with the Japanese. It was precisely at this trial that Vivian Bullwinkle gave her testimony about the massacre on Reykjavik Beach, located on Banka Island.
And after she testified at the Japanese War Crimes Tribunal in Tokyo in 1946, she told the world the horrific story of the massacre of the nurses. She said, "The Japanese came back and sat in front of us, and when they had finished cleaning their rifles and bayonets, they stood up, and the one in charge suggested that we should go towards the sea. He sent a couple of soldiers to push us along. We went towards the sea and kept walking. When we were up to our waists, they started firing up and down the line with the machine gun. There were 23, including myself, 22 nurses and 1 civilian."
Of the 65 Australian nurses on board the Viner Brook, 12 had drowned at sea, and 21 were fatally shot in the back during executions at Reykjavik Beach. The remainder were sent to prisoner of war camps, and all suffered terrible mistreatment for the remainder of the conflict, with many succumbing to starvation and disease. Despite all this, and Bullwinkle's cruel account of the carnage at the trials, no Japanese soldier was ever punished for his role in the massacre, nor was there any attempt to trace the perpetrators, and to this day their identity remains unknown. But far from the brutal story ending here, nearly 80 years later, the wounds of this atrocity have only grown worse. In 2019, a military historian named Lynette Silver revealed a shocking fact about the execution that took place in February 1942. Upon researching the event, it was found that before the machine gun murder on the beaches of Banka Island, the nurses had been raped by the Japanese, but the Australian authorities hushed up that part of the event. According to the woman who brought this disturbing detail to light, Australian military officials believed that this truth was too terrible to tell, and what they sought was to protect the families of the victims from the stigma of sexual abuse. This was considered shameful, and was even known as a fate worse than death. The relationship with this type of events in the country can be understood by knowing the punishments given to the perpetrators of rape, who in New South Wales were sentenced to hanging until 1955. The shocking fact that turned the Banka massacre into an even more brutal episode was confirmed by finding a statement by Vivian Bullwinkle herself to journalist Tess Lawrence. Shortly before dying in 2000, the nurse who had managed to survive the massacre admitted in an interview that she had been censored from speaking about the rapes in the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. In the interview, she confessed that most of her colleagues were abused before being shot, and that although she had wanted to reveal this story, she could not, as she had to follow orders from her superiors. However, she admitted that it was a secret that tortured her for decades. Continuing to research the issue, Silver also came across the account of a Japanese soldier being treated for malaria near Banka Island at the time of the massacre. He told an Australian officer that he heard screams and, upon questioning, was told that the soldiers were giving pleasure on the beach. Records of this were hard to find. In fact, the historian discovered that part of a page detailing what happened to the nurses in a key army report had been torn out, in what she believes was an act of censorship. Now, with the brutal secret out, a spokesman for Australia's Defence Forces said the decision to launch an inquiry was up to the government. However, families of victims who wish to do so can report new historical allegations to a unit that investigates such crimes. Whatever ultimately happens, the story of Vivian Bullwinkle and her comrades has served to continue to inspire the commitment of Australian women.
Vivian Bullwinkle was an Australian Army nurse, and she was a wonderful Australian. Vivian was injured on operations. She was shot on Banka Island alongside her colleagues who were all massacred. She's been a great inspiration to me. To have her immortalised in a sculpture represents all Australian nurses.
We want future generations, when they wander these magnificent gardens at the Australian War Memorial, I want kids to stop and ask the question, who was Vivian Bullwinkle? What did she do? And I know when they hear her story, they'll be inspired by it.
In addition to being a role model for future professionals, historian Lynette Silver also drew a parallel between what happened to the nurses on Banca Island and the Me Too movement, which has sought to encourage women to share their experiences of sexual abuse. Often, suffering this type of scourge considered taboo ends in censorship, and that is why the need arises to find the trust and support of people who have gone through the same thing in order to be able to talk about what happened. After learning about one of the most atrocious war crimes perpetrated by the Imperial Japanese Army, the time has come to say goodbye. But first, we would like to know what you think. Do you think the Australian authorities did the right thing by hiding the abuse suffered by the nurses? Could this fact have changed the punishment of the Japanese? Now, thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to seeing you in our next installment of Military History.